So why don't we start? Thank you all for doing this. I have a question, I think it's directed to New York City. How does New York City enforce climate change adaptation building codes on existing buildings?
It's a good one. It's honestly, it's some of our biggest challenge. It's easy to change a building code, and therefore you can take care of new construction. That's sort of a simple answer, and I think we've solved some of that, and there's more to come on different risks. We're doing some wind studies. We're looking at other risks. The existing building challenge is going to be one that's going to be a continuing challenge. We have a few things that we have up our sleeve on this. One is that we're pursuing a mandate for some of the largest buildings in the city to make the common sense solutions that we think make a whole lot of sense for buildings. Things like elevating their electrical equipment or otherwise providing protection for their critical building systems. We only envision that as for the largest of the large buildings, over 300,000 square feet and over 7 stories. There's about 80 buildings in New York City that fall into that category where we're pursuing those sort of mandates. We're also pursuing those sort of mandatory upgrades for healthcare facilities as well, for hospitals, where it's critically important to meet a higher level of protection and make sure that our healthcare facilities can stay in operation. That's one set. The other is a range of strategies for, those, at least for the floodplain, those other 68,000 buildings that we're not just going to step in and say you have to make investments. It doesn't seem reasonable. That's really not how we've approached building code changes in the past. Buildings that were damaged during the storm are one set of that remaining bucket of properties, and if they had tipped over the 50% threshold of damage versus, compared to their building's value, well, they're going to be rebuilding to higher standards. They have to meet the most modern building codes that we have in place now. So all of the especially homeowners that, we have 5,000 buildings that we ultimately expect will be elevated. These are mostly single-family homes in our coastal communities. That still leaves many other buildings that are going to be challenged to make these investments. And so we've started with an incentive program to be able to allow building owners, small businesses primarily, to make these sort of same investments of getting your electrical equipment out of the floodplain, the structural hardening of the first floors, those sort of simple things. We've also launched a pretty innovative competition where we are looking for resiliency technologies, and we did a global competition, and we're right now talking with over 30 different technology companies that want to pilot their ideas for small businesses in floodplains in New York City. And we got a lot of great ideas around telecommunications, around energy, just flood proofing, and we also have another set of small businesses that are willing to be guinea pigs in this endeavor. So we're making those matches right now, and that we think is ultimately going to seed some of the incentive program that we have, so that there are new technologies, perhaps more cost-effective technologies that can be applied, and just start to show people what this looks like in practice, which is really, we're at the beginning of that right now, and so we have some dollars to incent this behavior, but this is going to be long-term, and I think we need to find more dollars to do that. And then separately, insurance companies are ultimately coming in. This is not necessarily the NFIP, but private sector commercial policies are ultimately talking to their the policyholders about making these sort of same investments as well. And so they're gonna see it from lots of different sides in terms of reducing risk.
Thank you, Dan. Here's one, I think it's for Kairos. Given current plans for a $1 billion expansion of the Boston Convention Center, more hotels nearby, and new resort casino in low-lying Everett or Revere, are we not creating a major potential climate catastrophe? How can we break through the disconnect?
Well, the fortunate thing is that the large buildings are not the problem. I mean, I think that certainly when we're designing a new convention center and so on, we have an opportunity to make these projects, in fact, sort of models for how you would actually build a building within the vulnerable areas and make them resilient. I think my point, I guess, is that, and I think this is what Dan's point is too, the bigger problem is the parts of the city where we've already built. And so this retrofitting is really the larger question. I mean, so just to finish this whole notion, I think the point is that we are a coastal city. I think we just have to change our perception of about what that means and build accordingly. Like Dan said, prepare to get wet. And if you go to Venice in the spring when they have the tidal issues, you walk around with galoshes, and obviously the system of the canals is more expanded. And I think that you can live with it. And the problem is that there's so much of the building stock that isn't currently prepared. I just want to add one thing that Dan said. I think there's a zoning component, which is that we're looking at, in these areas where they're vulnerable, to figure out how within the zoning code that we can give relief of height. So that if people are investing in their existing buildings, we're not going to subject them to the existing height limits. And if you know the Boston zoning code, many of the built-out areas, in fact, the existing building stock already violate many of the height issues. The building industry, by the way, when we adopted some of the more, let's say, progressive ideas on commercial buildings reporting on their energy use, this notion that we're asking large building owners to now provide voluntarily their adaptation or operations plan when it comes to emergencies, the various commercial property associations were the ones that publicly resisted this, because they said this is another burden on the private sector to meet and figure out these things out. They didn't see it as the government saying, hey, you ought to pay attention to this, and we're asking you to disclose and share information. So on the commercial buildings, we're looking at if you voluntarily reinvest in your building to move your electrical gears and so on from a basement location, which is not counted as part of your FAR, to a location where it is where you have to substitute and displace, let's say, usable or rentable FAR, that we give them the ability to add on somewhere else. So that these notions of, let's say, at least not penalizing developers in being, let's say, responsive to climate change, I think is an important sort of baseline. So having said all of those things, I think of it, I think the one thing I didn't say, which I should say, is that there is no retreating. I mean, if you don't want to live in a coastal city and, adapt to it, there are plenty of non-coastal cities you can move to. I mean, you remember Ed Glazer? This is a choice. So that's why I said that this notion about our conception of what it means to live along the coast has to be, I think each of us have to sort of go through that. Each of our families have to go through it. Ed Glazer, famously, who is the professor at Harvard of economics but head of the Rappaport Institute, got rightfully sort of like chastised when after Katrina he said that, look, if you were doing this rationally, we shouldn't rebuild New Orleans. And he got killed, right? But he's saying, look, I'm just an economist saying what is a rational and economic thing to do. But we make all kinds of irrational decisions about settlements and so on. And I think that we're going through this period where we all have to sort of figure out what's rational, what's reasonable, and then put into the context of history. I can't see beyond sort of, in spite of the fact that I'm a planner, I can't see beyond like a few years. So for me, this notion of planning for the future is just planning to be best prepared, but not it's not the only path, right? Maybe in 100 years, Boston won't be Boston, New York won't be New York. I'm sure they actually won't be what we think they are. It would be transformed. But the notion that we are transforming with the knowledge of climate change is the more important kind of existential question I think we all have to come to terms. And it's great to see the MWRA looking at this in a very, very logical manner, right? But the one thing about that, when I see all of those things, is that you're still not 100% in any way close to 100% prepared. It gives you sort of peace of mind, but there are things that the weather is doing that simply we can't prepare for in the sense of, all the, because remember, by the way, I'm digressing a little bit. Did any of you see the Japanese government's recommendation for Fukushima and the village? They decided that they were going to build a 21-foot seawall, right? And everybody, and they tried to propose this, and they started to actually think about how to implement it. And I think the citizens of the village said, absolutely not, because if you do that, then we're not living in Fukushima. And so I think these are the kinds of questions we have to figure out, like what is not only what is logical, but what's right and appropriate, and we make choices accordingly.
I have a linked question here that's for anybody. To what degree are the climate adaptation resiliency planning and natural hazard mitigation planning integrated? And then there's a second question by somebody else. What percentage of your municipal population can be accommodated by present community shelters? So that's sort of the hazard mitigation side of things.
I'll try. I guess the hazard mitigation planning is, I think, more of an effort by the hazards community. So it's in a lot of ways it's a separate effort at least in the way Portsmouth works, that's taken care of by the hazards people. And so they're looking at a different way to plan. They're planning for life safety and health safety during a storm or a hazard event, whereas our planning is a little more long term. And so, but there is an important point to integrate the two, especially when you're talking about coastal storms and coastal flooding, and to bring what I wanted to bring home anyway was to start looking at the future instead of just looking at the past, and look at evacuation routes based on coastal flooding that they haven't looked at before. So I guess that's how they're linked. And the second part of the question was?
Just how much of the population can be accommodated in existing shelters?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not the hazard planner.
Nobody thought, no? Nope.
Should
Okay. Would it be useful, effective to require building owners to disclose the vulnerability of their buildings to flood, storm surge, et cetera? For example, require them to post a sign on the exterior indicated that they are in the 100-year flood zone? Yeah, I kind of like it.
Well, I mean, if you ask the same, the Massachusetts Board of Real Estate, I can't remember, I'm drawing a blank on their name, and NIOP and so on, they would say absolutely not. I disagree totally. I think that, I don't think you need to post it, but I think that there should be in the disclosure process when people are making decisions about where to live, that should be information that's readily available. And I think that in Boston, what we've said is that, look, private landowners, building owners, we're asking you for this information so we can put it on our website. Now, if you don't want to give it to us, we're going to use whatever model we have to share that information publicly. You can either give us what you think is the accurate information that you've assessed, or we could use a more generalized model that either would include your building or not. And I think it's necessary. I think that people, this is part of what's going to make our real estate market more competitive, not less competitive. The same way that we think disclosure, and New York pioneered this, the disclosure of energy use and all of that becomes one of the many factors that people are making decisions about. I think we should do that, like going back to what I was saying. All of our cities are competing for young people, right? Because we want young people who are going to grow our economy, grow our city. I think it's important that these young people are not moving here thinking that there's no vulnerabilities. I mean, I want them to make the decision with full knowledge. I think that's really important because, in fact, to let them know that we have these issues that we are confronting as a community is to also ask them to participate in the solution. I think this is really important, and participate in the public investment decisions that our politicians make on our behalf. We have to do that. And so I think, that will make us more competitive, not less competitive. And I think that the way we describe this to people has to be in that framework, not in the framework of, are we nuts, why are we living here? And by the way, don't tell anybody. I mean, that's the most, I think it's anti-intellectual, anti-community building, and I think we should get way beyond that.
We'll close with this one. What is the power of the pilot project in building the case for innovation, constructability, and replicability? Pilot project.
A planner wrote that question.
Yeah.
I don't understand what that means.
Well, I think you were talking about pilot projects, the historic buildings and that kind of thing, in terms of demonstrating a particular response.
Well,
measure.
There's nothing like a concrete example to
Right.
prove that what people think can't be done has been done and therefore is possible. So I think pilot projects are a great way to move things forward. And a lot of what we're doing on climate change, there's a lot of resistance. A lot of folks don't think it's fixable. And yet, you know, if you look around, you'll find some great examples. We're here, particularly here in New England, we think if it happened somewhere else, meaning as far away as Worcester, that it can't happen here, so maybe we need to have some pilot projects in every neighborhood, but they make a difference. People can, if you drive by something and say, that doesn't look so bad, it works, it looks safer, maybe you'll be inclined to invest in your building.
I also, Dan and I were actually together in February in New York City because New York was kind enough to host the 5 coastal cities on the Northeast Corridor that in different ways experienced Sandy. And I think that for us, the benefit is that we have, in many respects, New York City as the pilot project. And
Guinea
they've done
pig,
some,
if you will.
yeah, as a guinea pig. So, you know, we have the volunteering of a roadkill in front of us. And I mean, not to exaggerate, but there are so many good
Swing the day.
examples. And I think that the parochial nature of us in Boston is that, you know, New York, what we can't really learn from New York, but that's not the case. And I think that there's really great examples of some of, especially in the areas where you've rebuilt. The other area we've learned from New York is that it turns out that many of the building owners who also own buildings in Manhattan are the ones who are actually are more motivated in Boston. Because they realized that each day they couldn't get their building back in service was lost revenue, and they are, I think, are the standard bearers in a way in our city, and thanks to the sort of the experience from New York City. So I think that increasingly this notion of sharing experiences is going to be really important.
I mean, even go back to your earlier question around what the real estate industry would say about having to post their compliance or their vulnerability. Honestly, I think it's a competitive advantage for them to be making these investments. And tenants are asking the questions of, you know, if I move into this space in Lower Manhattan, how do I know that it's going to stay online when there's a next coastal storm? And so the landlords are being forced to ask that, and I think they can charge a premium for the rent when they can demonstrate they've got the operational or the capital investments being made in their facilities. So I'm not sure that they would necessarily say we're against sharing, but I think the ones that are forward thinking on this know that they're using it to their advantage, and it's a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So, you know, they're hearing it from tenants, they're going to hear it from insurance industries. When they ultimately hear it from the city, it probably erodes the competitive advantage, but makes the city better off as a whole when that comes down the line.
Well, thank you. Could you all join me in thanking the